Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Whale Project initiative. Today we're going to talk about Ukraine's war and many other topics that concern us Canadians. For us, for the country, for the world, welcome. Infantry, Airborne 103. ¿Qué es lo que pasa en la escuela militar? Que los reclutas nos quieren gobernar. Oye recluta, ¿por qué me miras mal? A tierra levantarse, con 100 pulgas continuar. Today you will be accompanying me to a running trail. This is what I do. Oh, Canada. Infantry, Airborne 103.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Moscow for talks with President Vladimir Putin in his first visit to Russia since it invaded Ukraine. Beijing's show of support for Putin comes days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin for war crimes for deporting Ukrainian children to Russia. This is ICC President Piotr Hofmansky.
The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Putin could be arrested if he travels to a member country of the International Criminal Court. Russia is not a member, nor are China, the United States, or India, which is hosting a G20 summit in New Delhi in December. In an apparent act of defiance, Putin visited the occupied Ukrainian city of Mariupol, a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. He also visited Crimea Saturday to mark the 9th anniversary of its annexation. In other news about the war, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations agreed Friday to extend a deal allowing for shipments of Ukrainian grain via Black Sea ports for 120 days. Here in the United States, The Guardian's reporting the Biden administration's quietly resumed deportations to Russia. After suspending them last year following the invasion of Ukraine, many of those facing deportation could end up in prison or on the front line if sent back home. Over the weekend, protests took place across the United States calling for an end to U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war as the world marks the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In the nation's capital, people rallied in front of the White House and marched in the streets of D.C. This is Claudia de la Cruz from the People's Forum.
We're here to let the world know that we are committed as a people to shut the war machine down. The planet and humanity depend on us. We gotta fight, we gotta continue to demand an end to NATO, an end to Africa, an end to the Southern Command, and the levels of sanctions that the U.S. has all across the globe. We need to continue to make the connections of working class people in the United States to working class people all around the world. So we're here making those demands. We're also recommitting ourselves to lift up the anti-war movement once again.
The Costs of War Project estimates up to 306,000 Iraqi civilians have died from direct war-related violence, while hundreds of thousands more Iraqi civilians have died from indirect causes and millions have been displaced. Some estimates put the death toll in Iraq at over 2 million. In the lead-up to the illegal U.S. invasion in 2003, tens of millions of people took to the streets and thousands of anti-war protests across the globe. After headlines will spend the hour looking at the U.S. invasion of Iraq with the Iraqi poet Sinan Antoun and French-Iraqi journalist and filmmaker Fouad Alani.
Hello guys, and welcome to a new edition of React Today, the World's Whale Project initiative. Today we're going to speak a little bit about war. What is the thing with war that the United States and NATO are always looking for? What is it that the only way for them for peace is nothing but war? Like when you read Matthew 24, one of the four Gospels, it's just what it says, that the world speaks and talks of peace, but we'll all be lies. We'll get back there. So yes, today we're going to speak about war and the movement of war. What is it that protesters against war are always persecuted, and they're always supposed to be quiet and keep quiet and do nothing about anything and just let, like in the war in Vietnam, which is a very significant war, especially for Americans, regardless of the movement and the peace talks that they wanted to have with their government, students, movements, all kinds of people came together, left, right, everybody was attached literally to the emotions and psychological warfare created not only by the FBI but the American government, guided by Richard Nixon, specifically, of course, Henry Kissinger and McNamara, in order to go to war with lies.
Everybody got in there. I got in the belly, you better get it.
Our country was murdering millions of people. Actually, the number is somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. This revelation was more than we could handle. We didn't know what to do about it. It was too great a fact. Every second of my life from 1965 to 1975, I was always aware that our country was attacking Vietnam. I could be up in the mountains, I'd be thinking about the war in Vietnam. I could be taking an acid trip and I'd be thinking about the war in Vietnam.
The war was escalating, the murder was escalating, and it was all being done in our names. And
violence in America today is not caused by the war. It's not caused by repression. There is no romantic ideal involved. Let's recognize these people for what they are. They're not romantic revolutionaries. They're the same thugs and hoodlums that have always plagued the good people.
232 GIs killed and 900 wounded makes one of the heaviest weeks of the Vietnam War. And it is not a week. It is just over 2 days, the past 2 days, two of the worst we have known in Vietnam.
This is 2-6 for a President document. Victor Charlie Southwest, heading north, Sound 2 north, have a great.
I joined the FBI in 1969.
Just the same lies that were told to us, the country and the world, regarding the war in Iraq, against Iraq, who displaced millions of peoples, killed more than 1 million people, more than 500,000 kids killed. And we all remember Mrs. Albright saying, yeah, it's okay, it's justifiable, we can keep on doing it. In what kind of person's brain there's a space to say that it's justifiable to kill half 500,000 kids, because we need to introduce democracy and to introduce the ways of democracy everywhere around the world, whether they like it or not. And that is a situation that has been lasted for the last 200 years, especially since the United States was created. If you read Noam Chomsky's books, he will recommend you to go back in history, and according to him and many others, the United States have always been at war, always, since the creation of the United States itself. So today we're going to speak a little bit and remember what is the importance, why it is important for us, the country and the world, and especially here in Canada, for the European friends, the UK and New Zealand and England, to go against war. Because this time, and this is my opinion according to the facts that I know, it's an informed opinion, and the documents I have read for you before, which for example includes the China goodwill interests that I read for you a couple years ago when it came out. The China Aerospace Studies Institute, in their own words, in which Russia and China come together in order to present to the United Nations their will for peace.
Countries around the world want to see the United States and China working together to address these challenges. Now, the fact that we seek to work together doesn't mean that we see eye to eye, quite the contrary. But where our interests align, and these are areas where our interests align, we think it is responsible, we think it is the right thing to do, we think it's the necessary thing to do for us to work together. Alex.
Let me follow up on that. I have two more other topics. Will the Secretary use the UN platform tomorrow to share what you guys already know about China-Russia cooperation?
I wouldn't expect him to go into any detail on this front. He has had an opportunity in recent days to speak to our concerns about what we've seen already between the PRC and Russia, or the concern we have that the PRC could take additional steps that they've heretofore declined to take. He spoke to that from Munich. He's spoken to that when he's been asked about it in recent days, including earlier today. Our message to the PRC has been consistent. They would decide to provide lethal assistance or to provide systematic assistance to Russia in its sanctions evasion at their own peril. It would come with costs and consequences from the United States, from the international community. We're watching this very closely. We've had these conversations directly, candidly, frankly, with the PRC, including when the Secretary met with Wang Yi in Munich just last weekend.
But do you have a new updated assessment on why China is doing what it is doing? I mean, quite honestly, they have been staying away from this for a year. It seems odd a little bit, you know.
I would actually disagree with that, Alex. I don't think China has been staying away from this for the past year. In fact, the PRC has been providing important support to Russia over the course of this last year. They attempt to maintain this veneer of neutrality, professing to the world that they're not taking a side, but they've clearly chosen a side. In the weeks leading up to this invasion, when it was crystal clear, at least should have been crystal clear to the PRC, what Russia intended, they signed this communique, 5,000-word communique that spoke of a partnership without limits. Over the course of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the PRC has provided diplomatic support, they've provided political support, they provided economic support. They have echoed and parroted Russia's propaganda, its lies, its distortions, its mistruths, in an effort to shield Russia and to propagate what it is trying to feed the world, a steady diet of disinformation and lies.
We have moved to Russia, Moldova, and Ukraine as well. You probably have seen the reports about Russia's false flag claims. Resembles, what they've been doing last year, this time, towards Ukraine.
Yes, you're going to say, but they invaded Ukraine and you can come with that rhetoric. Sure, if this is your opinion, this is not the program for you to watch. You don't have to agree with me, but your opinion can be valid, sure, for the ones that agree with the fact that we should go to war against the world because we are Americans and we want it that way, and Europeans and the British are escalating the war against Russia, and that will include us all. Canada will be targeted with atomic bombs. The United States, for the first time, will be targeted with atomic bombs. Europe will be devastated again because of the stupidity and lack of vision of the people that only look for war. And if we study from Vietnam, even though we can go further back, like in the Korean War and Enola Gay dropping a bomb in Hiroshima and then another one in Nagasaki, August 6th and 9th of 1945, I correct you. Then we have to understand that we can have our own opinions. You can, like I said, the parable of the sun. You can say that the sun is not going to shine tomorrow. And that's your opinion. And millions of people are going to come together and say, yeah, the sun's not going to come tomorrow, it's not going to show up in the morning. And millions of guys all around the world are going to say, yeah, the sun's not going to shine. As stupid as that opinion can be, it can have 100 millions of millions of people around the world saying that the sun's not going to shine tomorrow. That's your opinion, and that's many people's opinion regarding war and many other aspects like the pandemic. The point is that very probably the sun will shine tomorrow for you and I and everybody else. So, yeah, that can be your opinion, but you can be proven wrong. Truth and facts are that, truth and facts. And the war against truth has always been because of economic power. And we're seeing something that is no different. In the war against Russia using Ukraine, and testimony and the history examples that we have had in Central South America, Philippines, Malaysia, regarding the United States influence there, which is you do as we're told, as you're told, or we can take over and destroy you, like they did Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, etc. Endless wars that cost billions and trillions of dollars, and the American people going under with little salaries. And as many economists, Jeffrey Sachs, Richard Wolff, Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz and others have explained before for us, the country and the world, that's not the way to go. But the United States, especially England, and NATO countries with Mrs. van der and all these guys in Australia, AUKUS, and the UK wanting to control the South China Sea, which is Chinese. It can be international waters, sure. But who demarks that? Of course, United Nations. United Nations, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, are nothing but arms created by the United States. Israel, the United States, and the interest of England, this comes from the last century. This is not new. If you read the documents and the history behind how England betrayed Arab countries in order to give Israel the most benefits possible, and of course after the Second World War, Israel is being the country, I have nothing against that, that has been more favorably developed in all kinds of areas, technological, computer science, surveillance programs, Pegasus among others. They created Stuxnets with the United States, etc., which are spying programs that are anti-democratic. That's why Edward Snowden had to flee the United States, go to Japan, and then to Russia. That's why Julian Assange, free Julian Assange, release Julian Assange, hopefully soon. That will be a good demonstration of good faith, Joe Biden. But what we see in the mainstream media is the contrary. What we see in the mainstream media is nothing but war. And the decision to go to war against Russia and to malign Russia as the only country in the world that makes and causes harm and wants to create. The last incident, for example, with the American drone close by to Crimea, they say that there were in international waters, but there's treaties according to the version of Russia that they should not be using a drone that is American, thousands and thousands miles away from their land, to go to other people's places and do as they will. Because that's something that only a bully can do, and that's what the United States have proven for the last decades, especially after the Second World War. The war in Vietnam is one of the examples of how capitalists, as warned by Dwight Eisenhower and by President John F. Kennedy, the military-industrial complex and the tentacles that they can use with the CIA and politicians who all eat from the same table, Republicans and Democrats, in order to go to war against Russia. The most stupid idea for the 21st century. Why not get along? Remember? Why can't we get along? Can't we get along? Why don't we get along? That was in 1990 or 91, beat up by the police to a black person who said that. I forgot his name. I apologize. So today we're going to make a little historic reminiscence about what and why it's important for us, the country and the world, to oppose war. Because I said it again, this time Canada is going to understand by force and the stupidity of our leaders who always do what America says. It's like a doggy that always jumping on the lady's leg. With no independence whatsoever. I understand that Ottawa is going to be the place here in Canada to crown the new King of England, Charles, King Charles, here in Ottawa. What is the significance of that? It means that Canada is going to keep on becoming more like the United States and becoming more like England. That means poverty, that means lack of employment, that means menacing, that means dictatorial powers like Justin Trudeau with the situation with China just abroad himself by decree. Powers that he shouldn't have. That is, that in order to avoid China's influence in the elections, etc., he's going to have new powers, more powers, not only regarding medical issues, vaccination program, etc., which have been proven by scientists and nowadays that it was made in laboratory, that it was on purpose spread all around the world because it was already planned. If you find 2015 TED Talks with Bill Gates, if you follow up the 201 exercise, and 3 months later the pandemic began, the ineffectiveness of proven, documented by myself, many doctors like Dr. Batayarta, Janajan Batayarta, and many others, Robert Malone, Dr. which is of course in the Senate in the United States right now, on very serious debates against Dr. Fauci and his influence. The book that I always recommend to you regarding this issue, which is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. book regarding the pandemic, and delinquent, the criminal attitude of the pharmaceuticals and the politicians, the mainstream media, the core of the health systems and the sunshine lists, which I already read for you, which includes of course Australia, New Zealand, England, European countries, United States, and of course Canada, which abided treasoning. That's treason. I mean, when politicians make the decisions to corrupt the whole health system and to abide by the economic favors that Pfizer, which produces only in 2022 $100 billion with money that was paid by contributors, that is taxpayers. The same in England with Moderna. Moderna is also American, AstraZeneca, I say here, but Moderna is in the interest of Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci, as we know, received 350 million benefits for his intervention regarding the silencing all medical opinions and avoiding the medical procedures regarding how to prove as a health system representative, NIH, the FDA, the CDC, all of them corrupted to the core in order to support a vaccine that we know it doesn't work, especially when I read you in the last program that 88% is the improvement of people that have the infection. If you got the infection, natural immunity will protect you 88% more than 2 jabs of any vaccine, especially Pfizer.
A new study has found that immunity acquired from a COVID infection is on par with the protection provided through 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine. Infection-acquired immunity cut the risk of hospitalization and death from a COVID reinfection by 88% for at least 10 months, the Lancet study found.
The immunity generated from an infection was found to be at least as high, if not higher than that provided by 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine, the authors wrote. Senior study author Christopher Murray said, this is really good news in the sense that protection against severe disease and death after infection is really quite sustained at 10 months. NBC News writes. Yeah, that's an incredible study, especially the part about the longevity. Because think of the concern a lot of people had with both the protection from prior infection and protection from the vaccines is, well, how long does this last? Because that's the fundamental question you're having to consider when thinking about whether or not it's time to boost, or whether you want to.
Does it wane more easily or more rapidly for people who are immunocompromised, or the elderly, the people we want, to be protected anyway? Yeah, I saw a lot of people talking about this online with a certain amount of well-deserved smug satisfaction, because people have been saying for a long time that it seemed likely there would be some good level of protection after an infection, and the Faucis of the world they've admitted it by now, but they really did slow walk that one.
Yeah.
They took a long time to say that there was so much downplaying of it, so much dismissing of it, that was really harmful. There was it doesn't really matter if if you've already had it, you still got to get vaccinated, which now we know that should be considered. If you've had it, that should be considered like one or maybe even two shots or something.
And the implications, of course, as we've discussed, for the people who lost their jobs because there were vaccine
mandates.
Oh,
absolutely.
The athletes that weren't able to travel to the country because there's vaccine mandates. It's incredible. And not to mention the level of course, social shaming that existed around the idea that you're going to kill somebody's grandma because you don't go ahead and get vaccinated. I think that a lot of people really did believe that in good faith. Take that for what you will, because there was such a lack of clarity in the media sphere. I just had a conversation with someone on my podcast actually earlier this month who seemed to just not really know what the new science had said. And because I think so many of the voices that were leading on this were not necessarily voices that were trusted among liberals or even among certain parts of the left, they were acting in ignorance and frankly behaving in a way that was judgmental, that was ultimately damaging to our understanding of the science and our ability to communicate it across different political camps.
And it would have affected the messaging because particularly with the subsequent variants, COVID becoming extremely infectious, it becoming harder and harder to avoid it entirely, even if you're taking extreme precautions. The messaging could have been like, well, have you had it yet? Okay, if you haven't had it yet and you're in a 65 plus category, look, you should get the vaccine to decrease your risk of severe disease and death when you then get COVID. If you've already had COVID, great. This is not, make whatever choice you want, but it's not as pivotal. But if you know you've not had it, you should plan on, it's hard to avoid, you have a high likelihood of getting it, and you might benefit, especially if you're in that age category, from vaccination first. But if you've already had, there'll be more trust if the experts were saying, look, the key is, do you have any kind of protection yet to COVID? Find out, oh, you do. Okay, well then this is less of a dire situation then, because you have some protection. And I think if you'd leveled with people on that, it could have been really helpful for the campaign to actually encourage vaccination in the at-risk population. Absolutely, and I do hope they continue. I mean, I'm sure they are, but they continue to do these studies about how long the protective effects of these things last. When I was talking to people like Vijay Prasad about the decision making around the booster shots, which had just come out at the time, and the decision making that people were going through, I took a lot of what he said to heart. But the question for me was, okay, but at some point we can all acknowledge that this is probably, the protection is going to taper off, whether it's from a vaccine or from a prior infection. And you can't completely ignore the relevance of boosters as long as that's the case. And are we going to be able to tell when it wears off before we have some huge wave of folks who are getting reinfected and then going into the hospital because they no longer have that infection? Or is there a way to predict that beforehand and to evade the enormous burden that would put on both the healthcare infrastructure and on obviously the people who are going to get sick and suffer? And I think that's the real unknown here that I hope scientists are getting to the bottom of. Yeah, and it should, if there's ever, we go through this again, God forbidding, hopefully not, there should be a little bit more humility from the medical establishment to begin with, on all fronts, right? There was, well, we don't know about this, but then confident assertions. I mean, there was confident assertions about how the vaccines would drastically reduce cases as well. They look at the studies; they're really effective against that, and you know that came apart.
Yeah, and look, it is also worth noting that there were some bold claims that were made about the kinds of things that would prevent COVID that were not vaccine related.
Mm-hmm.
Some of which were not validated by science.
Yep,
Some of which had some validation that was minor and not really substantial.
Yep.
So there have been mistakes made across kind of the political spectrum.
There's a lot of wishful thinking about exactly.
And I'm not equating what some online person says about what treatment might be good versus what the CDC told us and misled us for a long time at all. But, you know, there is like a kind of a fog of war, confusion, some of which is in good faith. And I hope that we're able to figure out a way to regain trust and to not just be pointing fingers, because conflicts like, tragedies like this, emergencies like this are not going to go away, and even COVID isn't going to go away.
People who credibly ran with all of that stuff could have used the application of an extra dose of skepticism, the skepticism they applied to the mainstream, the vaccines, et cetera. They could use a dose of skepticism in that direction, and people who put utter blind faith in what the medical establishment recommended, but confidently asserted that all the other stuff was that's obvious fraud, should apply some skepticism the other way. We'd all benefit from a little bit of a...
Are you intentionally framing it as a dose because you're in this pharmaceutical mindset?
Yes,
a double injection of some skepticism.
Yes, just like how I said the Buttigieg's career has been derailed. We were talking about
very nice.
We're using literary references.
Love the wordplay, Ravi, today.
Mm-hmm. More rising right after this. Nonprofit government watchdog group OpenTheBooks.com alleges that Pfizer pays third-party royalties to the NIH and that the NIH is refusing to fully comply with Freedom of Information Act requests. Here's the organization's Adam Andrzejewski speaking with reporter Cheryl Atkinson on the subject.
So our data shows at OpenTheBooks.com that every single year NIH doles out $32 billion in federal grant making to 56,000 entities. And that basically buys you the entire American healthcare space.
Now, royalty payments to researchers is not new and it's perfectly legal thanks to the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, but concerns of transparency around the practice remain.
You may remember this exchange between Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci concerning royalties. Let's take a look.
We've been asking you, and you refuse to answer, whether anybody on the vaccine committees gets royalties from the pharmaceutical companies. I asked you last time, and what was your response? We don't have to tell you.
Right.
We've demanded them through Freedom of Information Act, and what have you said? We're not going to tell you. But I tell you this, when we get in charge, we're going to change the rules, and you will have to divulge where you get your royalties from what companies, and if anybody in the committee has a conflict of interest, we're going to learn about it. I promise you that.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that, please? Okay, there are two aspects for what you said. You keep saying you approve, you do this, you do that. The committees that give the approval are FDA through their advisory committee. The committees that recommend are CDC through their advisory committee. And you keep saying, I'm the one that's approving a vaccine based on certain data. So I don't really understand, with all due respect, Senator.
You're the one that said you would not reveal what companies gave you royalties or what company gave the other scientists royalties.
Gotta move
That's
on.
what you told the committee.
Senator Paul,
Sir,
you gotta move on.
Could I please answer that?
Briefly,
You
yes.
keep asking committees, they're not my committees.
Now, it's important to note that in 2005, Dr. Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, told the Associated Press that he donates royalty payments he receives from the licensees of products he helped develop while working for the National Institutes of Health.
Rising has reached out to the NIH to request comment, but we have not heard back at the time of this taping. Here to discuss is freelance journalist and author of Owning the Sun, A People's History of Monopoly Medicine from Aspirin to COVID-19 Vaccines, Alexander Zaitchik. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks so much for joining us. This is a complicated subject. Can you tell us more about the royalty system and how this law from the 1980s set it up, what it was designed to do, and what the issue is now?
Right. As I understand it, it's still pretty much capped at about $150,000. So the numbers that we're talking about in the context of pharmaceutical profits, the monopoly system that drives the drug industry is, is relatively small peanuts. And companies paying the government royalties is sort of more or less how it's always worked pre and post Bayh-Dole. The government has an invention, they're supposed to license it out. In my view, the big scandal is not so much researchers receiving royalty payments for their work, so much as it is a symptom of this larger coziness between the government and an industry that is basically using the monopoly system to price gouge the American people. And the NIH has basically abandoned its role to serve the public and instead has become much too aligned with the industry and is an enabler, an accomplice, and a protector of these monopolies. And the vaccines are a point in case. Government science was basically given along with these massive research subsidies through warp speed to Moderna, for example, and there were no public interest provisions attached. There was no pricing promises. There was no request that technology be transferred with other parts of the world. It was basically a conveyor belt for private industry. And it's worth noting that there's also a FOIA request on Moderna's royalty payments from Knowledge Ecology International, an organization in DC run by James Love. And they have been a lot less forthcoming than Pfizer, and they actually did not pay any royalties for a long time. So Pfizer is actually, in the context of all this, a better actor than Moderna in terms of using government science for their vaccine. So yeah, you're right. It is a complicated issue, but for me, the real problem is NIH fully aligned with industry on the monopoly question when public science is involved and at the heart of an important breakthrough like a vaccine.
So I was perusing your article from 2001 about this 1980 law that basically enabled this shift. And as I understand it, there used to be a presumption, the base level standard was that if there was an innovation, a vaccine, some other scientific development that was developed as a consequence and funded by the government, then the expectation was that the public should be able to benefit from it without having to pay. It was developed with public dollars. It should be at the public benefit and not have the kind of monopoly power that is normally granted through copyright, driving up prices and excluding public actors from being able to access it. And then at some point, because of lobbying in the late 1970s, that shifted so that the government had to the presumptions shifted, so the government had to prove that it should have that privilege as opposed to the default being that way. Can you unpack that for us a little bit and help us understand why that shift occurred?
Yeah, for most of the post-war era, there was a default position within health, education, and welfare, as it used to be known, that if a government invention was a result mostly of government research, there may have been private partnership involved at various stages, but if it was largely funded by the government, then the patent should stay within the people's hands. It should be public property, and it should be broadly diffused and licensed very broadly, because that is the whole purpose of these billions of dollars of NIH research grants, is to benefit the American people and the world. That used to be, it's still carved in the building. And in the 1970s, the pharmaceutical industry convinced Congress and ultimately Jimmy Carter that this policy was harming, slowing innovation, and that if corporations and drug companies were able to claim the patents, then there would be much more progress, and there'd be much more development, and we'd see more life-saving medicines that currently are being stymied by government control. This was based on a lot of very bad arguments that are beyond the scope of this interview. But what it did was create this system where government science could be claimed hot off the press by companies and monopolized. And these monopolies that result from this conveyor belt, unfortunately, are not even the traditional monopolies of 17 years, but they're being evergreened, and they're turning into these sort of permanent monopolies. So the the sort of double payment of the American people is ongoing. The first payment, of course, is their tax dollars funding the $32 billion that was referenced in the interview at the Open, and then the monopoly prices, which continue. And the NIH has a responsibility to enforce the public interest measures within Bayh-Dole, because it's a bad law, but it does have a rider that says, in the interests of the American people, generic production can be mandated. And every single time that groups, patient groups, nonprofits have come to the NIH and said, enforce that provision, because this monopoly is hurting consumers and people who are sick, and you invented this thing and you have the power to lower the price, they have rejected that. The NIH has rejected a petition that's been on its desk, and Joe Biden's desk, by the way, since day one, to allow generic production of Xtandi, which was invented by the US Army. The United States Army invented a breakthrough prostate cancer drug that is 6 times what it costs in other parts of the world. So all they have to do is say, yes, we're going to enforce our own laws. And they're not, because they're completely in bed with the companies who are profiting,
Right, and with companies that have basically gained an exclusive right to produce these drugs that the government has given them with government, like that's because this is even harming, of course it's harming the groups you're talking about, the patients, but it's also harming competitors, right? Other companies are not allowed to develop these things because of the government granting a monopoly in perpetuity on a specific product that government research funded.
Yes, it's a completely anti-competitive policy that the NIH is allowing to flourish, and that was not the vision. When these research institutions were founded after World War II, the idea was to foster competition within the drug industry, because that would reduce prices, allow access, and ultimately drive diffusion, which is the whole point of the patent system, is to diffuse technology, not allow it to be enclosed and privatized and blocked off from competition. So it's a bad policy in every possible way, and the NIH has completely abandoned its responsibility to enforce even the wiggle room that the bad laws we have allow. And the royalty payments are a symptom of that, but it's hardly the scandal here.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a bow on that royalty payments bit, I mean, there are people who, I know that you characterize this as a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but there are people who say that there's a conflict of interest fundamentally if someone like Dr. Fauci is both influencing public policy and making recommendations about vaccine use, and also getting any degree of money, I don't want to use the word kickback, but getting any degree of money as a consequence of those policy decisions. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair argument. And in a perfect system or a better system, government scientists would do their jobs for a salary because they are interested in furthering science and developing medicine. And companies would be happy to use that science to make a product, and the government could pay them for it if they needed to partner with industry. But yeah, there's really no reason for everyone to be rooting for these monopoly prices so that they can benefit. And everybody is benefiting right now who's a part of this system. A lot of these scientists are going off to work for these companies, or they work for government labs that are later able to claim the patent themselves. And then, of course, they make much more than $150,000 on the royalty. It's not a royalty. They're basically claiming ownership. That revolving door takes place. I mean, the whole system up and down has been completely corrupted by the amount of money and power that the industry has been allowed to amass because of the corruption of the patent system in general.
Alexander, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.
So, with all these lies, if we don't react today to these matters, that will explain that it is the peoples that are really stupid, if you find the definition in the dictionary. Let's find it. And I don't want to believe that Canadians are stupid, neither Americans, Europeans, but the political class, the corrupted political class of this world, which has been easily bought by the power of brute capital, has become the norm. And we, the people, are permitting that, not any longer. If there's a bit of dignity in the peoples, we shouldn't tolerate that any longer. Especially when there's scientific proof that this world is in the wrong hands, and that's the political class, corrupted to the core, participating with stock, not only in pharmaceuticals, but Republicans and Democrats in the case of the United States. The Sunshine List here in Canada, for example, is something that media should investigate, but no, it's all about Russia. It's all about vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. So, yeah, stupidity. Stupid. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it says, noun, stupider, stupidest, more stupid and most stupid are also common, showing a lack of thought or good judgment. That's to be stupid. Second definition, slow to learn or understand things. To be slow to learn or understand things, that's the second definition. Not clever or intelligent. He'll manage, he isn't stupid. She always makes me feel really stupid. Behavior that shows a lack of thought or good judgment. I couldn't believe my own stupidity.
I now recognize Ms. Maliotakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you. Chairman, for 2 years, myself and the other Republicans on this subcommittee connected the dots. We exposed the evidence supporting our strong belief that COVID was developed and leaked from the Wuhan lab. And during those same 2 years, the same Democrats that sit on this committee, they only hindered, they obstructed, they refused to hold hearings and get to the truth. Now we see mounting evidence supporting the COVID-19 originated from the lab in Wuhan, China, run by the Communist Chinese Party. And this hearing is about getting to the truth. I thank the chairman for making this the very first hearing, because the American people who have seen just as many fellow Americans die from COVID, as nearly as many die from COVID, that died in every war since the American Revolution combined, deserve to know the truth. Dr. Redfield, you pointed to the lab leak theory even before we did. In mid-January of 2020, you expressed concerns to Dr. Fauci, to Jeremy Farrar of UK's Wellcome Trust, and to Dr. Tedros of World Health Organization that, quote, we had to take the lab leak hypothesis with extreme seriousness. And you urged Dr. Fauci to investigate both the lab and the natural hypotheses. Shortly thereafter, on February 1st, Farrar convened a meeting of a group of 11 top scientists across 5 time zones and asked Dr. Fauci to join, and he wrote, quote, my preference is to keep this group really tight. Obviously, ask everyone to treat in total confidence, unquote. Dr. Redfield, you were excluded from this call, but up until then, you had been on every single, you were included in every other conversation. What changed? Why do you think that you were excluded from these conversations?
Thank you very much. I think just to emphasize, in early to mid-January, I did have multiple calls with Fauci, Farrar, and Tedros about how important I thought it was that science get engaged in aggressively pursuing both hypotheses. I also expressed, as a clinical virologist, that I felt it was not scientifically plausible that this virus went from a bat to humans and became one of the most infectious viruses that we have for humans. All viruses are not the same. So when you look at coronaviruses for SARS and MERS, for example, when they entered the human species, which they did via an intermediate, they never learned how to go human to human. Even to this day, they don't know how to go human to human. So you can't equate Ebola with a coronavirus.
Now, why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Okay. In emails following the conference call, 4 of the 11 scientists told Fauci that they all found the genetic sequence inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, basically what you're saying. However, just 3 days later, these 4 scientists had drafted a paper arguing the exact opposite, and that's now the infamous proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Our investigations show that this paper was prompted by Dr. Fauci, among others, with a goal to disprove the lab leak theory. What is the likelihood that these scientists came across additional information just 3 days after making these statements to conclude with such certainty that COVID-19 came from nature instead of the lab leak that they thought it was 3 days earlier?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Again, I've said this before, that this whole approach that was taken on February 1st and subsequently in the month of February, if you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science.
Thank you.
Science has debate, and they squashed any debate.
Thank you. Given what we know now and looking at all the conversations in February of 2020 and before the release of the paper, do you think that Dr. Fauci used this paper to hide the gain-of-function research created this virus?
I can't talk about Fauci's motivation.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
I got 20 seconds left. Dr. Fauci was affirmatively told in an email that NIAID had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through EcoHealth Alliance. He was told this in January 27th of 2020. Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Okay, so which one is Canadians? Which one are us Canadians? Which one is you Americans? Which one is you Europeans? Which one is you UK? Which one is you Australians? And which one are you New Zealanders? And Central and South America and the Global South. We need to define that today, because the same is happening with the war. Whether we are slow to get it, whether you are really stupid, or you get annoyed, literally of a slow thinking that can process reality or facts and believe better in the hypothesis of the sun and regarding the opinions. As an example I put in the beginning, or the facts. So let's begin with the facts. That was the protests that were happening in Vietnam War. And this is just a little bit of examples. The war in Iraq was the same. I showed you a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago, a program with an spy novelist who actually was a writer, but he also worked for the MI5 and MI6. And he was saying exactly what I'm repeating here today, and it's that the manifestations against the war in Iraq, in Europe, just in London, more than 1 million people. What did the government say? What Tony Blair did? Went to war.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Well, we're on the road here in London, and much of Britain remains abuzz over the publication of former Prime Minister Tony Blair's memoir, A Journey. In the book, Blair's continued to defend the 2003 U.S.-British invasion of Iraq as justified. The memoir broke sales records, but Blair was forced to cancel a recent book signing in London over fears of a large turnout from anti-war protesters. The cancellation came just days after 3 people were arrested for throwing eggs and shoes at Blair as he arrived for a book event in Dublin. Well, on Sunday, I had a chance to interview David Cornwell, the legendary British novelist who writes under the name John le Carré. He's a former spy with the MI5, which we're broadcasting just across the Thames from, and the MI6, which is just down the river. These are the British equivalents of the FBI and CIA. Le Carré began writing novels in the early 60s. His books include The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and The Constant Gardener. John le Carré's latest novel, Our Kind of Traitor, will be published soon in the United States. In the lead up to the Iraq invasion, John le Carré was a fierce critic of President Bush and Tony Blair. In January 2003, he published a widely read essay called The United States of America Has Gone Mad. We'll broadcast our full interview with John le Carré soon, but today we thought we'd share an excerpt of his comments about former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. I asked John le Carré if he would go to one of Tony Blair's book events.
No, I wouldn't, nor would I buy the book. At the last election in which he stood, I was invited by the Guardian newspaper to interview him. And after much thought, I declined because I did not see how I could lay a glove on him. And I've asked some pretty heavy-hitting journalists what questions they would have asked in retrospect that might have unseated him a little, that might have thrown him. And they said almost with one voice, there's nothing you can get past him. There's no way of doing it. I think I would have asked him one question, perhaps, and I'd have asked it repeatedly. I'd have asked him about his faith, because we were told when journalists asked about Blair's faith, the reply was, we don't do God here. Well, of course, he does do God. And he reports that his actions have been put before God and confirmed, as if somehow God has signed a chit for him. I think that the question of somebody's religious faith is absolutely central to what we think of them. If we are members of the electorate, we have to know. If it is, for example, somebody's conviction, widely held among Christians in the United States, that the second coming of Christ is not possible till the greater Israel is established, we need to know that. That's an important political perception. In Blair's case, I would have asked him that question, and I'd have pressed him on it. I'd have asked him whether God had ever restrained him. I find it very strange that we elect a politician who then claims to serve a higher deity who guides him. I did what I believe is right. Well, will you tell us, please, how that relates to the Christian ethic? Do you believe in war first and negotiation afterwards? Exactly how does this work? And the second question I would ask him is the really painful one, which I could not have asked if I hadn't gone on my own journeying. Have you ever seen what happens when a grenade goes off in a school? Do you really know what you're doing when you order shock and awe? Are you prepared to kneel beside a dying soldier and tell him why he went to Iraq? Or why he went to any war? I think that if anything has happened to Europe since 1945 that defines it, it is collectively Europeans do not believe in war anymore until it comes as an absolute last resort, and then they're going to do it rather badly. The United States, I think, still sees war as a necessary part of its existence. It's impossible to maintain the military on that scale, a Pentagon on that scale, without turning it over. You've got to have officers who are experienced in command and control. You've got to have troops who've been blooded. So we were in that sense at odds. I was, as a European. I was at odds with the whole notion of a preemptive strike. And I think many Europeans have that in common. Of course, with very many Americans too, feel the same. So I would have tried to challenge him in that area. And as I think I said earlier in the interview, for me, there are very few absolutes about human behavior. But I think a leader who does take his country to war under false pretenses is simply not an acceptable person. I don't think that we should be weighing the rights and wrongs of that. It seems to me to be quite simply wrong.
And what did the American people did in the United States and all around the world? Protest against the war. And what did the American... The axis of evil. These people want to destroy us and our freedoms. The same discourse we are hearing from generals, politicians, secretaries of state, speakers of the White House. Russia is the people to kill and destroy, so we can Canadians participate in a war against Russian people, like the Mrs. Jolie says just a couple of days ago or yesterday, that the war against Russia should continue and they're going to be till the end with Ukraine.
It's been nearly 13 months since Russia invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine. Ukraine has been independent since 1991 and has presented no threat whatsoever to Russia. Russia launched and has continued for over a year now a war of aggression in flagrant violation of international law.
So yes, this is a conspiracy, and calling it a conspiracy theory only makes clear no individual could have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline. This was a group. This was a very hard thing to do. It's 70 meters below sea level. It was delayed detonation. If anybody knows about Nord Stream, it's encased in a massive amount of concrete. This was a big operation. So a conspiracy? Absolutely yes. The Russian government asked for an investigation. An independent UN Security Council-led investigation, not a Russian investigation. The Chinese government supported Russia in this, and the United States said, this is a distraction. Maybe I'm wrong. Investigate it. You know? But the United States says, no, don't investigate it. That's a distraction. Well, I think it's a distraction most likely from U.S. culpability. But to not investigate? What kind of attitude is that? And it is, again, I have to emphasize, fundamentally a threat to our democratic institutions. The German government doesn't speak to the German people about this. The Bundestag can't get information. The Swedish government went down to the crime scene and then announced that they would keep their investigation secret from Germany and Denmark. Duh, that's a little strange. Or from the UN Security Council. If people think that secrecy is safety right now, they really misunderstand what's happening.
This is and remains a Russian frontal assault on the rules-based international order that has been in place for 80 years 8 decades since the end of World War II. In the face of this act of aggression, in a war of conquest, this group remains unified. NATO is united. The people of Ukraine are unyielding. They are standing steadfast in the face of the Russian onslaught. Russia remains isolated. Their military stocks are rapidly depleting. Their soldiers are demoralized, untrained, unmotivated conscripts and convicts, and their leadership is failing them. Having already failed in their strategic objectives, Russia is increasingly relying on other countries, such as Iran and North Korea, as the Secretary pointed out. They're using Iranian drones to continue to terrorize Ukrainian civilians. This relationship is built on the cruel bonds of oppressing freedom, subverting liberty.
My name's David Gilbert. I'm now in Comstock Prison doing a life bid. In terms of mistakes we made, I'm willing to take responsibility, pay a price. I really haven't complained too much about my own personal situation. But was I fighting for a just cause? That's the motivation? Was there a need to do something about what was going on? Yes, there was.
Free the Panther 21, jail the real criminals. Power to the people.
"232 GIs killed and 900 wounded makes one of the heaviest weeks of the Vietnam War. And it is not a week. It is just over 2 days, the past 2 days, 2 of the worst we have known in Vietnam.
This is 2-6 for a present attack at the Victor Charlie Southwest, heading south to north, that's great.
I got the belly, you better get it.
Our country was murdering millions of people. Actually, the number is somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. This revelation was more than we could handle. We didn't know what to do about it. It was too great a fact.
And maintaining their tyranny. Yet free people will not return to the shackles of tyranny. Ukrainians remain defiant, with steel in their spines and courage in their veins, and they have the broad support of the United States and the international community. The Battle of Bakhmut continues, but Ukraine is fighting with valor. With robust defenses, Ukraine has fixed the Russian forces at that city, and they're exacting very heavy costs on the Wagner Group and the Russian regular military. Ukraine remains strong.
Now, you will have patience, listen to me, and will not interrupt me for 2 minutes. And I will ask you that what I say, you would publish without cuts, without censorship. Can you do it? Do you have the power to publish this uncut, uncensored?
Yes, of course.
How stupid these politicians think people are. And how stupid, like I said, slow in thinking, in processing reality, can we Canadians be? If we go to war against Russia, Russia is going to target Canada. Is that what we want? In order for us, the country and the world, to say, Russia, mother, you bitches, you evil people? No. It will be very, very stupid for us, the country and the world, to believe such a thing. The aggressor is not Russia, as this general is speaking, saying that the aggressor is Russia. Yes, the aggressor was Russia when it took crossed the borders of Ukraine. But it's impossible to disregard the documents presented here as the one that I just showed you here, in good faith from China and Russia, and the management of the war. Ukrainian, this one, which was very highly criticized by Amnesty International Canada, not the rest of the nations, but Amnesty International Canada, very criticized because you're not supposed to say anything against Ukraine. They are speaking about in the United Nations about criminal wars against humanity in the war in Ukraine, a war that America, United Kingdom, and NATO could have averted and avoid, but no, they wanted to go to war, as they always do. And Vietnam is going to give us, again, another example, because they're going to start calling people to go to war against Russia here in Canada, there in the United States, and very probable they might start again the draft system in order to go to war.
But I think that in the past week or two, we've seen a few rays of hope, and it's something that Stavroula Pabst, who's a Gray Zone contributor, covered for us at the Gray Zone, and I, co-authored a piece with her on the wave of anti-war rallies across the Atlantic, from Washington, D.C. on February 19th to this huge rally in Berlin, which had as many as 5,000 people at the Brandenburg Gate, sponsored by the Die Linke parties, Sarah Wagenknecht and Alice Schwarzer, who is a renowned feminist writer in Germany, to call for an end to the Ukraine proxy war, an end to German government support for the proxy war. Wagenknecht was asked, do you denounce any people from the Alternative for Deutschland right-wing party who would like to attend this rally? And she said, no, everybody is welcome. And so it was, as with all the rallies we're seeing across Western Europe, a show of right-left unity against the Ukraine proxy war. Stavroula also interviewed the planners of those massive Czech rallies we saw in the fall of 2022 in Prague, where 70 to 100,000 people protested the war from right and left, communist and right-wing nationalist parties together. This is a huge threat to the system, and specifically, I mean the EU and NATO. And the momentum is gathering. Protests in Brussels with thousands of people, led by Mick Wallace and Claire Daly, European parliamentarians. A huge protest by the Stop the War Coalition in London, and the No to NATO conference on the same day, which I and Anya Parampil participated in, along with Chris Williamson, Loki, George Galloway, and others. Massive protest in Paris calling for Emmanuel Macron to resign over this proxy war and the abandonment of French sovereignty to NATO and the European Union, and on and on. There was even a protest in the freezing tundra of Montreal. So let's watch a portion of Sarah Wagenknecht's speech before we go, because I think this does offer some hope, and I think the strategic calculus is beginning to change a little bit for the war planners as they're seeing grassroots mobilization against the war. We don't feel that our interests are represented by the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who, like an elephant in a china shop,
die wie ein Elefant im Porzellanladen über das internationale Parkett trampelt und ihre
and is so out of control of her public statements that she accidentally declares war on Russia.
aus Versehen Russland den Krieg erklärt. Wir fühlen
We
uns
do not
auch
feel that our
nicht
interests
vertreten
are represented by the defense
von einer
industry lobbyist Strack Zimmerman,
Zimmermann, der die Geschäftsbilanz
who cares about the financial situation of Rheinmetall and company more than about the fate of the people of Ukraine or the world. Same with Raytheon and Lockheed Martin in the US.
Der Weltfrieden. Aber wir fühlen uns auch nicht
We also don't
vertreten
feel that our interests are represented by the
bei dem
Chancellor Olaf
Kanzler,
Scholz, who at first
der zwar
hesitated
zunächst
and
immer
called for prudence
zögert
and
und für
caution,
Bedachtsamkeit und Vorsicht wirbt, aber dann
and then
trotzdem
gave up,
regelmäßig
having
vor
heard
den
enough of the militarists from the ruling
in seiner
coalition, and now
Koalition
crosses one line
einknickt
after another.
und eine rote Linie nach der nächsten überschreitet. Nein, Herr Scholz, auch von
No,
Ihnen
Mr. Schultz,
fühlen
you
wir
don't
uns
represent
nicht
our interests.
vertreten. Wir wollen nicht
We do not
mit
want
deutschen Panzern
German tanks
auf die
to fire on the
Urenkel
great-grandchildren
jener russischen
of
Frauen
Russian
und
women
Männer
and men.
geschossen wird. Das ist wirklich völlig
This is complete
geschichtsvergessen.
historical amnesia.
Haben die denn überhaupt
Have you
nicht mehr im
forgotten
Kopf,
German
was
history?
deutsche Geschichte mal war? Wir
And so clearly a reference to World War II, where now we could potentially see, with the arrival of German Leopard tanks, the first armored confrontation between German and Russian tanks since World War II. And there were battles between German panzer divisions and the Red Army in Kherson, which is where these tanks are being sent to. So,
and Schultz is such a chump that he gets roped into promising all these Leopard tanks to Ukraine on the condition that other NATO allies provide them too. And since then, what's happened? None of them have stepped up. None of them, except for maybe one country. But now Germany's been left holding the bag of supplying the tanks, because other people don't want to give their tanks. And the U.S. M1 Abrams tanks are just purely decorative, because there's no expectation that Ukraine will be able to use them, and they're not getting there for at least another year. So that's another way in which Germany has been completely left hung out to dry, which happens to totally conform to the long-standing U.S. goal of severing ties between Germany and Russia. So not just the short-term goal of making sure that Germany doesn't get second thoughts about being part of the proxy war, but also advancing a long-time goal of severing Russian-German ties, because Russia and Germany united would be a threat to U.S. dominance of Europe. That's what it comes down to. And Olaf Scholz has done the bidding of that agenda perfectly, and now you're seeing the result, finally people coming out.
They're going to call for volunteers, etc. Many issues that war has to do in order to destroy us, the country, and the world. And like I said it before, I reiterate it now. You might believe in UFOs or not. It's not a matter of believing in UFO. The word belief means the concept, the idea, the security, the assurance that you believe in something that you have not yet seen. That's the definition of faith. To believe in something that you have not yet seen, which is God or Jesus Christ. And in second coming, the evangelical literature, doctrine, etc. You can't believe that because nobody has seen God. We have seen it in the universe, we have seen it in the organization of the stars, we have seen it with Nicolas Copernicus, we have seen it with Isaac Newton, we have seen it with how many astronomers and scientists that have discovered for us the country. Edwin Hubble, for example, discovered that the galaxies are moving away, that we don't only have planets but galaxies, and the galaxies are moving away, the spectrometry, etc., based on Isaac Newton discoveries on 18 months running away from a plague. So yeah, Johannes Kepler, etc. I can't carry on. Albert Einstein, yes, I like him. He's very important. Relativity theory and the special relativity theory, sure, incredible. But nothing like the Serbian scientist Nikola Tesla. That's top of the line scientist. He ended up living in a hotel, feeding the dogs, because the enterprise and the capitalism of the time, the Morgans, JP Morgan and Westinghouse, enriched themselves billionaires with his inventions and ideas, only to turn their back on him. But now, 100 years later, we have Wi-Fi, we have all the inventions that he patented, taken away from him, and used against us, the country and the world, with surveillance programs, etc. So when it comes to war, and the injustice and the systems that are used in order to stop us, the country and the world, who believe to stop the war in Ukraine immediately and to release Julian Assange. You can have, for example, this book, the never before told full story of the history-changing break-in at the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, by a group of unlikely activists, quite ordinary, hardworking Americans, that made clear the shocking truth and confirm what some had long suspected, that J. Edgar Hoover had created and was operating, in violation of the United States Constitution, his own shadow bureau of investigation. That hasn't changed already. We see that the FBI is being used as a political instrument against the other parties. They all want power. It begins in 1971, back in America, being split apart by the Vietnam War. A small group of activists, 8 men and women, the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, inspired by Daniel Berrigan's rebellious Catholic peace movement, set out to use a more active but non-violent method of civil disobedience to provide hard evidence once and for all that the government was operating outside the laws of the land. The same that happens with the drone thousands of miles away of America. Okay, so let's say that Russia sends drones in the Gulf of Mexico, or put bases in Mexico, and here in Canada. Get back to the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. The would-be burglars, non-pros, were ordinary people leading lives of purpose. A professor of religion and former freedom rider, a daycare director, a physicist, a cab driver, an anti-war activist, a lock-picker, a graduate student haunted by members of her family lost to the Holocaust and the passivity of German civilians under Nazi rule. Betty Metzger's extraordinary book recreates in resonant detail how this group of unknowing thieves, in their meticulous planning of the burglary, scouted out the low-security FBI building in a small town just west of Philadelphia, taking into consideration every possible factor, and how they planned the break-in for the night of the long-anticipated boxing match between Joe Frazier, war-supported and friend to President Nixon, and Muhammad Ali, convicted for refusing to serve in the military, knowing that all would be fixated on their televisions and radios. Metzger writes that the burglars remove all of the FBI files and with the utmost deliberation release them to various journalists and members of Congress, soon upending the public's perception of the inviolate head of the bureau and paving the way for the first overhaul of the FBI since Hoover became its director in 1924. And we see how the release of the FBI files to the press set the stage for the sensational release 3 months later by Daniel Ellsberg of the top secret 7,000 pages Pentagon study on the U.S. decision-making regarding the Vietnam War, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. At the heart of the heist at the book, the contents of the FBI files revealing J. Edgar Hoover's secret counterintelligence program, quote-unquote COINTELPRO, set up in 1956 to investigate and disrupt dissident political groups in the United States in order, and I quote, to enhance the paranoia endemic in these circles, unquote, to make clear to all Americans that the FBI agent was, and I quote, behind every mailbox, unquote, a plan that will discredit, destabilize, and demoralize groups, many of them legal civil rights organizations and anti-war groups that Hoover found offensive, as well as black power groups, students, activists, anti-draft protesters, conscientious objectors. The author, the first reporter to receive the FBI files, began to cover this story during the 3 years she worked for the Washington Post and continued her investigation long after she'd left the paper, figuring out who the burglars were and convincing them, after decades of silence, to come forward and tell their extraordinary story. The Burglary is an important and riveting book, a portrait of the potential power of nonviolent resistance and the destructive power of excessive government secrecy and spying. What we're doing here now, I just showed you the book. It's edited by Knopf. It's a wonderful read. You have to read this book. It's just amazing. It's also, she was a member, Beth Mischer, was a member of the group that this year just gathered in order to fight for the release of Julian Assange. Something that we, the people here in Canada, will love to see. And that will be to see Julian free, released from prison. So when you see these things happening, you have to ask yourself, am I being ignorant on purpose? Do I qualify as stupid according to the Oxford definition? Or am I going to take part in this and say, hey, these politicians are taking us, the country and the world, to the edge of a third world war. And that will be the end. If I were you, like I have, I will find out where is the nearest nuclear bunker for you to hide in case the bombs start falling, because what Canada with Mrs. Jolie and the United States with foreign policy, England, which is pushing way too hard to go to war against Russia and China, and politicians that are guiding us, the country and the world, to war against Russia and China, it's going to cause a devastating effect, especially if atomic winter takes over, because that will happen after 10 or 20 bombs with the capacity and the megatons that they have, which are 100, 1,000 times bigger, more powerful than that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you have seen the Bikini Atoll was used in order to provide the Americans with a place to experiment with the peoples there in the atoll, Bikini Atoll, where people suffer from radiation, and they were exposed to radiation on purpose in order to find out how to deal with people with radiation, and of course to improve the capacity of the atomic bombs and the hydrogen bombs in order to study the effects on the peoples. Only demented people do that, and colonizers. And if there's something we have not yet learned, especially Canadians, with this Prime Minister, liberals or conservatives are the same. You have to remember that Stephen Harper do as Americans say. And now that England is crowning the king here in Canada, that's most telling. So is Canada free, or is the political class of Canada bending over to the colonial strategy of the British Empire, which already died after the First World War? But they still believe they're the emperor because they have the support of the most powerful country, the most bigger bully with atomic bombs. And that's not the way to create politics. That's not democracy. And you have to understand, dear friends here, that power is not the end of the mission of the politician. Power is just the means to go further. That is my informed opinion. No civilization in the universe will ever develop and thrive if it doesn't take care of the most important, valuable asset they have, and that is their peoples, their populace. If United States, Canada don't care about their populace, but to control them, to break them, to freeze their assets, to freeze their accounts, to put them in jail, to send them to the streets, to create camps to reform their minds, like the United States and Homeland Security have been sent since 2001. This is the most stupid, unadvanced, devolving system in the universe. And it's not that we are only the worst soap opera in the universe, but we are the example not to follow anywhere in the galaxy, and I hope the universe itself. Wherever the other guys come, but if the atomic bombs start falling in Canada, we are going to understand, I hope not, that it was the Russians. No, it was the bad foreign policy decision making, the corrupt Congress and Parliament here in Canada. Congress in the United States is very corrupt. Like I said, they have a stock in weapons industry that has been proven. The documents I have shown for you for the last 5 years, and many other YouTubers have shown you documents, very important documents, that prove that the Congress and Parliament in Canada, that is still secret because there's no journalism here. So we, the citizens, are claiming to the Prime Minister we want to be paid by our time here, and if we have some money, we can produce better news, and we can go to the places and we can cover the action where it's happening, and uncover for you, the country and the world, for us, the country and the world, the proceedings in Parliament here in Canada, there in the UK, whatever. But no, it's not happening. The money is being allocated to the most corrupt of the systems, one of the most corrupt systems that allies with the politicians and the industry in order to keep people stupid, dominated, submitted, and we call ourselves democracy?
Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Mascott, when was Dr. Fauci elected to office?
At no time.
Has he ever been elected to anything?
I have not. He's not, certainly not in the current role.
Is he a member of Congress?
No.
Now, Dr. Fauci's a smart guy. In fact, if you don't believe me, just ask him. He said Sunday on a TV show that, quote, I represent science. So I'm not saying he's not a smart individual, but who does Dr. Fauci answer to?
Well, I mean, well, at this point, I mean, presumably indirectly to the president, but I take your point.
Well, I don't think I don't even think, Professor, with all due respect, I don't even think he answered to the president, because President Biden says we follow the science, and Dr. Fauci has basically said, I am science. I'm almost like God speaking. So I don't even think he answers to the president. So this is what scares me, is the fact that it's people who've never put their name on a ballot, never went out and talked to we the people, who are making the decisions. And frankly, the Democrats' witness likes it that way. Let me just read from Mr. Michaels, Professor Michaels' testimony this morning. Just one sentence. We need an agile regulatory system to address the climate crisis, COVID-19 variants, environmental injustice, massive income, wealth inequality, affordable housing shortage, antibiotic resistance organism, the opioid overdose epidemic, and threats to the financial stability posed by cryptocurrency. We don't need a Congress. We don't need a Congress. We got this regulatory system that the Democrat witness thinks we need. So forget like putting your name on a ballot, going actually out and talking to the people and get elected to office and being in the United States Congress. We don't need it, according to Mr. Michaels. So isn't that your concern?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on a very poignant example in current practice where we have a significant problem facing the country, obviously the pandemic, and there's a very broad statute, the quarantine statute from the 1940s, that had not been carried out anywhere close to the way it has been applied recently in the past.
But Mr. Michaels doesn't want to limit it to that. Dr. Fauci may want to. Who knows what he wants to? He probably just wants to be dictator. But Mr. Michaels doesn't want to limit it to that. He talks about affordable housing. He's talking about cryptocurrency. He's talking about environmental injustice. I mean, he's talking about all kinds of things that he thinks the regulatory state needs to be able to agilely, or in some kind of fashion, be able to deal with. So yes. It's not just quarantine issues.
Well, of course, and I think the reason what you're pointing to, right, is the breadth of the law and how it's being interpreted. And if we defer to the executive branch's interpretation, that housing and cryptocurrency and whatever else falls within.
But that's sort of how it works, isn't it? I mean, there's always some exceptions, and there's some give and take in the comment period of these. But the agency proposes a rule, then they enforce the rule, and then if there's a dispute, they have an Article 1 judge, executive branch judge, adjudicate. So again, and they want more of that. They want them to do that for everything. So why do we need a Congress?
Right, the concentration of power, I think, in single entities is one of the greatest problems facing our system of government.
No kidding. No kidding. Some of these people, I mean, the people who make decisions and impact small business owners, Americans, I mean, just every single day, the regulatory state, the bureaucratic state runs this country, and it is a huge problem. It's the biggest threat to liberty I think we see. And I haven't seen the bill that the chairman is introducing. But my gut tells me it probably moves in the direction that their witnesses want it to go, which is more power to the bureaucratic state. Is that your interpretation of their bill? I don't know if you've seen it either, because I haven't.
I have not seen the bill. I will say I think the most constitutional approach would be for power to be dispersed among different decision makers, state, local communities, families, then at the federal level, policymaking in Congress. And you all have a lot of power here to be able to put those systems in place and make policy decisions.
We're supposed to have a lot of power, something we need to claim back or take back. This idea that bureaucrats are going to run the country is, as I said before, frightening. You said this earlier. I just want to read this. I think this is you put this well, and you just basically said the same thing. The distribution of power over separate branches of government helps to ensure that each branch can more effectively perform its function of serving as a check on the other branches in order to better secure, this is the important part, the private interest of every individual. The security for civil rights consists in the multiplicity of interests. That is the Constitution. That's what this committee is supposed to uphold. More than any other committee in the Congress, we're supposed to be focused on that. And yet we have witnesses come in here and basically say, do away with Congress, let the regulatory state run the country. That is frightening. I yield back.
We are acting worse than Saudi Arabia when we do this here in Canada, which is to arrest the people, to submit them to silence, and to use force. And that is something that I would like to end with. The Canadian policemen didn't attack furiously the convoy and the people that manifested in Ottawa or here in different cities across the country, because the Canadian police is civilized. Until now, I hope, keeps that mandate, which is to accompany the protesters instead of, like in America, shooting them and killing them. You know? Or like in Australia, which is one of the worst examples of how police is against their own people. The police is paid by the people. People pay taxes in order for the cops to be paid and protect the people. That's what they're supposed to do. But they're militarizing police in Australia, New Zealand, and now with AUKUS, even worse. They're taking the money of education infrastructure to put it towards war, and the AUKUS here in Australia, England, and the United States, possibly New Zealand, but it's not working because more people are allying with China and Russia. Countries in Africa are allying more with China and Russia. $261 billion investment from China to Africa. And you hear the African leaders commenting, for example, the president of Rwanda and many others out of the 54 countries in Africa are siding with China. Why? Because China is not menacing them. They're saying, I'm your friend and I'm gonna fucking kick your ass because you don't have International Monetary Fund, because you don't cut services, because you don't privatize, and because you don't put people to suffer. China's not doing that, neither is Russia. And that is explained in this document that I read for you. Again, so we Canadians have the truth, and the truth is what we're fighting for here. For us, for the country, and for the world. That's what this program is all about. Support the channel, Federico Molano /Patreon, Federico Molano, or Patreon /The World's Way Out Project. Okay guys, I hope that you understand that this is very important to understand, and that we cannot trust the political parties here in Canada. Maybe we have no choice but to vote for the Conservatives, but the Conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP are like the Republicans and the Democrats and the Conservatives in our neighbor, the United States, which being the most powerful country in the world could have done and could have still do so much good around the world, but they are blinded by power. And like I said, power is just the means to advance as a civilization and thrive as a civilization, to be welcomed by other civilizations, in order to find out that this civilization took care of their peoples in advancing their education, their technological system, to stop polluting the planet and to transcend, which is the purpose of the World's Way Out Project. The World's Way Out Project is about biomimicry. The World's Way Out Project is about understanding Eugene Mallop's initiatives when it comes to energy. We're not talking about wind and solar only. We're talking about different ionized factors of energy that can be used and channeled in order to produce free energy for all. There shouldn't be poverty in the 21st century. There's no excuse for that. But you still see the banks falling down in the United States like birds. Inexplicably. But of course the reason is clear. They want more power to destroy themselves and the planet. What is it that they promise you, politicians here in Canada, there in England? What is it that they promise you? Who did that? The military-industrial complex and their friends out in space? Because it's clear in the Word of God when it says that the struggle is not against blood and bone. The struggle is against principalities, kingdoms, dominions up in the sky. Who is promising these politicians that by destroying their own peoples is the way to go in order to keep the planet just for the few? That's very stupid. And to not understand that power is not in the bellicose systems, because a bully can only last until somebody stands up to him. And in this case, it's going to be the global South. Central and South America is already starting. And of course, United States, when it's losing power, is going to try to grab it, and war is the only way out. The same with UK. Pride, it can destroy us all. But if the nukes start coming, we're going to see UFOs and UAPs maybe by the thousands, because they're going to try to save the earth. I hope. I really hope. Otherwise, I'm still asking my Lord to come before this happens. But if apparently the majority of the people that side with the governments around the world are like the definition of the Oxford Dictionary. I hope you're not one of them. I am not. One of the other issues that should wake us up is the alliance between Iran and Saudi Arabia. As you can see, Saudi Arabia is taking sides and is picking up with China and Russia. Somehow that should be taken like treason against the United States, because the United States have protected Saudi Arabia since the beginning of the last century, offering protection. But Saudi Arabia has enough money to be independent and has enough weaponry bought from the United States, the most the biggest seller of weaponry around the world, along with Israel and other countries. But this is something that I spoke about in my book in 2014, and I have mentioned over the years in anticipation for this issue, and that was the coming together of the Sunnis and Shias all around the world, and to stop division regarding not only religious matters, which can complicate things worse, but and it can be used, of course, as always, in order to evoke the principles of war. We're going to be taken off by pagans and by barbarians and all that crap. No. We can understand ourselves with other countries as long as we respect the other people's economies, the other people's resources. But as long as we see the other countries as booty to take over control and massacre and destroy and create corruption and create elite so they can be bribed and we can take over the resources of other countries, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. And a demonstration of that is not me saying it, it's the alliance between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Enemies that haven't spoken more than 7 years. They broke their relations more than 7 years ago. So if that doesn't tell you something, of course, that the United States is just looking for war because it wants to keep the hegemony. The United States can be very good politically guiding force, but it decided not to be. It goes against its people first, and the rest of the world, it doesn't care about but the first 1%ers. And this devil is going to have to show its face pretty soon. But the point is, the only way for the United States to make peace is if people do as they say. They can destroy a country like they have destroyed Libya. Look how Libya is living now.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa. The problem is the opposite. We keep asking for people to intervene and stop it. And there's no question that the presence of petroleum throughout the region has sparked great power involvement. Whether that was the specific motivation for the coup or not, I can't tell you, but there's always been this attitude that somehow we could intervene and use force in the region.
Look how Iraq is living now. 20 years of the war in Iraq, against Iraq, based on lies. The same with Vietnam.
On August 2nd, the destroyer Maddox reported it was attacked by a North Vietnamese patrol boat. It was an act of aggression against us. We were in international waters. I sent officials from the Defense Department out, and we recovered pieces of North Vietnamese shells that were clearly identified as North Vietnamese shells from the deck of the Maddox. So there was no question in my mind that it had occurred. But in any event, we didn't respond. Two days later, the Maddox and the Turner Joy 2 destroyers reported they were attacked.
Where are these torpedoes coming from? Well, we don't know. Presumably from these unidentified craft.
There were sonar soundings, torpedoes had been detected, other indications of attack from patrol boats. We spent about 10 hours that day trying to find out what in the hell had happened. At one point, the commander of the ship said, "We're not certain of the attack." Another point, they said, "Yes, we're absolutely positive." And then finally, late in the day, Admiral Sharp said, "Yes, we're certain it happened." So I reported this to Johnson, and as a result, there were bombing attacks on targets in North Vietnam. Johnson said, "We may have to escalate. I'm not going to do it without congressional authority." And he put forward a resolution, the language of which gave complete authority to the president to take the nation to war. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Now, let me go back to the August 4th attack.
Well, there apparently been at least 9 torpedoes in the water. All missed. Yeah. No, I don't. Wait a minute now. I'm not so sure about this number of engaged. Right. We'd have to check it out here. He said many of the reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports.
Okay, well, I'll tell Mr. McNamara this.
That's the best I can give you, Dave. Sorry. It does appear now that a lot of these torpedo attacks were from the sonar man, you see. And they get keyed up to a thing like this. Everything they hear on the sonar is a torpedo.
You're pretty sure there was a torpedo attack then?
Oh, no doubt about that, yeah. I think. No doubt about that.
No, it was just confusion. And events afterwards showed that our judgment that we'd been attacked that day was wrong. It didn't happen.
Peoples around the world, economies around the world, industries around the world have sided together and said, Canada, United States, UK, NATO, F off. We don't want you anymore. You're liars. You don't understand how to transcend. You're devolving as a civilization, devolving us, the country and the world as a civilization. You have the wrong idea. Even the Chinese are more transcendent than the so-called Christians in the West. I can't believe that. That it's obvious that religion, the Catholic Church and the evangelicals have a fundamental role in this stupidity that is going on around the world, because they buy the stories that the enemy is Russia and only Russia. They cannot have self-criticism. I reiterate, it's my coined word. Self-criticism is a virtue. That's what it is. If we can criticize ourselves and say we're doing the wrong thing, man, we can advance. Power is not the end. Power is just the means to get to transcend. If we have the power to make every people happy, if we have the power to pay good salaries, if we have the power to educate our people, we're going to be a better civilization than the one we are now. Instead of looking down, we're going to end up looking up. Remember the picture by Raphael? Plato looking up and Socrates showing the world of science and what it is, nature. Well, we can go up now with both the circumstances scientifically, but even science has been so corrupted. The denial of the UFO existence for 75 years, 80 years. That's unacceptable. And these alliances between Saudi Arabia, Shiites and Sunnis is very important for the Arab world. And not only that, now Saudi Arabia knows how to produce atomic bombs. They're not telling us that, but the United States 2 years ago, since Biden administration and the final administration with Donald Trump, start negotiations in order for Saudi Arabia, in alliance with Israel, to have hegemony with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates in order to control the east of the American, Israeli, UK's, Australia will. But tensions are going high, divisions are strengthening, and once divided enemies have come together in order to protect their own interests, because the United States have failed as an empire to understand that colonization doesn't work anymore. The only way to make a transcendent humanity is to come together and develop together, not to go against each other. Together we stand, divided we fall. And there's no way that God himself are going to let just 1% to take over. Because is that the God I believe in? Because last I heard, and this I finish with this, Nancy Pelosi called an exorcist to his house in San Francisco. Because she wants to keep the malign influences away from her house. For us, for the country, for the world, hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Real Project Initiative. Au revoir. Bye bye. Hasta pronto.